Hi, everybody. Welcome. So glad you're here. I'm pleased to tell you the McGill program in journalistic courage continues to strengthen. I'm Charles Davis, the Dean of Henry W. Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication. And for 36 years, the McGill Lecture has brought significant figures in journalism to the University of Georgia to help us honor Ralph McGill's courage as an editor. 8 years ago, we added the McGill Symposium, bringing together students, faculty, and leading journalists to consider what journalistic courage means and how it is exemplified by reporters and editors. Earlier this year, we awarded the 6th McGill Medal to a U.S. journalist whose career has exemplified journalistic courage. The medal went to Glenn Greenwald, the U.S. journalist most associated with coverage of U.S. government surveillance records leaked by Edward Snowden. All of this is for a single purpose: to advance journalistic courage. The 8th McGill Symposium was today. For nearly 5 hours, students, faculty, and visiting journalists discussed such topics as Ferguson, Missouri, where conflicts come home, the NFL beat, exposing the ills in America's favorite sport, the courage to ask tough questions, and Face-to-Face with Ebola, a reporter's perspective. They were lively discussions about critical matters, and they all involved journalistic courage. Soon we will publish and post edited proceedings from the symposium so that the discussion may be shared with students, faculty, and professionals everywhere. 12 of our best journalism students participated in the symposium. They were selected by a faculty committee for their strengths in academic achievement, practical experience, and leadership. We call them the McGill Fellows, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. When I call your name, please join me at the front of the auditorium. And I'd also like to invite Diane Murray, who co-directs the program, to the front to present the fellows with their McGill Honor Cords. Brenna Beach. Ashka Dave. Khadija Dukes. Hyacinth Empanado. Hayden Field. Michael Fu. Jake Lieber. Wallace Morgan. Brittany Ray. Katie Roberts. Aaron Smith. And Ben Wolk. Let's give these distinguished students a round of applause. I'd also like to thank the McGill visiting journalist who came to Athens for the symposium. Please join me in thanking Wiley Price, a photographer from the St. Louis American, Ken Benson, a sports reporter from the New York Times, Antonio Mora, host of Consider This on Al Jazeera America, and Todd Frankel, a reporter from the Washington Post. And finally, permit me to acknowledge the faculty committee that selected the McGill Fellows and who moderated the McGill Symposium. They are Carolina Acosta-Alzura, Valerie Boyd, John Greenman, Janice Hume, Mark Johnson, Vicki Michaelis, Chris Shumway, and Patricia Thomas. Thank you to all of those members of the committee. John Greenman co-directs this program with Diane Murray. For them, it's a year-long effort. Trust me, it is a year-long effort. Thanks to you both for your hard work. And now let me turn this over to Professor Acosta-Alzura, who will introduce this year's McGill Lecture. Carolina? Absolutely.
Good afternoon. I'm Carolina Acosta-Alzura, Dr. A, as my students call me. Nobel Prize in Literature recipient Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a journalist by trade, once said that journalism is the best job in the world. And it's also an insatiable passion that can only be digested and humanized through its stark confrontation with reality. Antonio Mora exemplifies that definition, and I'm honored to introduce him as the 36th McGill Lecturer. He is the host of Consider This, a nightly current affairs program on Al Jazeera America, where his interviewing style shines and his rigorous preparation is evidenced. Antonio Mora is best known nationally for his 4 years as the news anchor, senior correspondent, and regular substitute host for Good Morning America. He reported for virtually all of ABC News broadcasts, including Nightline and 2020, covering news from more than a dozen countries on 4 continents. He has been recognized for excellence throughout his career, receiving awards for reporting, anchoring, breaking news anchoring, interviewing, and commentary. His many honors include 2 that are very significant to us here at UGA, 2 Peabody Awards, but also a National Edward R. Murrow Award, 3 national Emmys, 9 local Emmys, and a Silver Dome. Born in Cuba and bilingual English-Spanish without an accent in either language, which I can tell you that's kind of difficult. Antonio Mora is one of the only Hispanic men to anchor a regularly scheduled national broadcast news show. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former vice president of broadcast for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and is actively involved in many nonprofit organizations and charities. Hispanic Business Magazine named him one of the country's 100 most influential Hispanics. As a Grady College faculty member and as a Grady graduate myself, I'm pleased, very pleased, for all these reasons, Antonio Mora is the first Hispanic journalist to deliver the McGill Lecture. But I'm also delighted at a more personal level. I have known Antonio since our teenage years, when we both lived in my native Venezuela. Then, as now, he excelled in all his endeavors through discipline, study, hard work, and commitment to excellence. Then, as now, he was determined to make a difference, a resolve that is probably the best source of human courage, and an indispensable ingredient for the best brand of journalism. Then, as now, I was immensely proud to be his friend. Please help me welcome the 36th McGill Lecturer, Antonio Mora.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here, and I think I'd like to have Carolina introduce me every time I get introduced anywhere again in my life. It really is a pleasure to be here. I've fallen in love with Athens in the 24 hours I've been here, and certainly after having one of Cecilia's cakes at lunch today. I don't know if you've ever had one of those, but those cakes are phenomenal. This is a beautiful campus. You are so lucky to be here. It's a special honor to be involved with anything connected to Ralph McGill. For a Southerner to have fought segregation publicly, as he did at a time when few of his peers would have spoken out privately, required extraordinary courage. I can claim one insignificant thing in common with him is that we both got into trouble for criticizing our high schools and student publications. He, however, got suspended. I've managed to somehow dodge that bullet. I'm also honored to follow in the footsteps of many people I've admired who have been here and given this McGill Lecture before. Tom Wicker, Frank DeFord, my old friend David Lawrence, who's given up journalism to become a tireless advocate for children around the world, and Katharine Graham, who of course is in the news indirectly today with the passing of Ben Bradley yesterday. She was the publisher of the Washington Post, and they risked everything back then to cover the Watergate story, and that, if anything, is probably the epitome of courage in journalism. Especially excited to be here as you guys celebrate your centennial. Also, in a week where graduateprograms.com recognized you as one of the top 5 journalism programs in the country. Congratulations, that's terrific. As Carolina said, I've been fortunate to be the first Hispanic to do a bunch of things. And I'm very grateful that you chose me to be the first one to give this lecture. You also haven't had a broadcast journalist since 1999 when another friend of mine was here, Deborah Roberts. So don't wait 15 years for the next one. And I understand that having a TV guy here is especially propitious this year because you've merged the print and television sides of Grady College. And it's not a great idea. It's not just a great idea because we're all journalists and we have more similarities than we have differences. It's also because the distinction between print and broadcast is really getting blurred more and more every day. More and more often TV journalists having to blog, they have to write their pieces up for their employers' websites, and journalists from everything from newspapers to the wire services are having to put video and even interviews as companion pieces to the things that they post on their newspaper websites. Just a few weeks ago, the first video when the Leon Panetta story broke about his new book and how he criticized President Obama, the first video that we all had to use of Obama criticizing the president was an interview that was conducted by USA Today and posted on their website. So the thought of TV outlets around the country using video from a print organization it was pretty much unheard of, except in the last couple of years. So again, these lines are blurred. So I think it's a very smart thing that you've done to combine the programs. And while we've heard a lot about the struggles of newspapers and magazines in this internet age, certainly TV is confronting similar challenges and troubled times. From there, the title of this lecture that affect local stations, it affects cable news networks, it affects the broadcast news networks. And I'd argue that the genesis of these challenges probably four significant events, and I hope you don't mind a little bit of a history talk. The first happened before most of the students here were born. It was the loss of independence of the broadcast networks that happened back in the mid-'80s. The second involved the trial of the century, the O.J. Simpson trial. The third had to do with a White House intern in 1998. And then, of course, the internet. I'm not going to delve much into the internet because I think enough has been spoken about that. But going back to 1985, 1986, in 1 year, the three major television networks, and back then there really were only three major television networks, were all taken over by other companies. And competition from cable at that point was really kind of insignificant. There were only a couple of dozen cable channels out there, so it was really still ABC, NBC, and CBS. CNN was around, but people at the networks used to make fun of CNN and called it the chicken noodle network because they just weren't up to broadcast news standards. So the networks were really a virtual monopoly. As a result, they were incredible cash cows. They were making just incredible amounts of money, tremendous profits. And that allowed them this incredible freedom that, sort of looking back in history, making so much money from their entertainment divisions and from their local stations, the local stations they owned, that they were flush with cash and they had the luxury to look at their news divisions as a public responsibility, as a public trust. Which actually, again, brings me back to Ben Bradley and what President Obama said about Ben Bradley yesterday. He said that Ben Bradley saw journalism as a public good, vital to our democracy. And that was very much what inspired the broadcast networks back then. But part of it was that they didn't mind if their news divisions lost money, which this day and age is completely difficult to believe. But without the pressure to make money, the networks just spent money like drunken sailors. And it was great. If you loved, hard news, it was terrific because the news divisions had, bureaus all over the world. They had a huge stable of correspondents and producers. They had the resources to cover the big stories whenever they happened and wherever they happened. And they also had the luxury to choose to cover the most important stories. At least the most important stories as determined by a couple of dozen mostly white guys who lived on the west side of Manhattan. But that's a whole other story. But still, there was really very little fluff. TV news was far more consequential than it is today. It was far more influential as well as a result. And just to give you a little, I hope the history lesson doesn't bore you, but in 1986, the US population was roughly 3/4 of what it is today. But about 50 million people watched the 3 evening newscasts every single day. Today, barely 20 million people do. About 1 in 5 of all Americans watched back then. Now it's only about 1 in 15, and it actually was about 1 in 3 adults would watch one of the evening newscasts every single day. So imagine the power, if you're communicating to that many people every single day, the power that these network newscasts had and the network anchors had. it was probably most famously acknowledged by Lyndon Johnson when in 1968, in the middle of the Vietnam War, Walter Cronkite, who was then the CBS Evening News anchor, he said, he spoke out against American involvement on the CBS Evening News. And LBJ reportedly said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And that it was really a turning point in American attitudes toward the Vietnam War. It's not clear whether the quote is apocryphal or not, but what's certain is that the evening newscasts really did help drive opposition to the war, to inspire the civil rights movement, to call attention to corruption in government around the country. But then these acquisitions happened in the mid-'80s. They were gobbled up by companies that didn't have any allegiance to news, and that forced the news division to slash costs and maximize profits. Ken Auletto wrote a great book called Three Blind Mice, and he talks about how the consequences were noticeable immediately. These very substantial newscasts, all of a sudden stuff started creeping in that never would have been in there before. Network news started getting dumbing down, sensationalism started creeping in. News divisions were producing specials called Scared Sexless and Women Behind Bars. They were going for the eyeballs. They wanted to get people to watch no matter what they did. And that was a very big change. Celebrity news, which normally was ignored in the evening newscast, started creeping in too, because surveys showed that people cared more about Michael Jackson than they did about a coup in some foreign country. So the change began back then. And then we can jump forward to Friday, June 17th of 1994. And I was having dinner at a restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and come out of the restaurant, and there's this bar next door. And it is packed. And there are people on the sidewalk looking through the windows. Now, I knew that the Knicks were playing an NBA final, so my first reaction was, oh, what's happening to the Knicks? It turned out that the Knicks had been preempted, and all the TVs in the bar were all showing a white Bronco being followed by a bunch of police cars down Southern California freeways. It was really kind of the beginning of the O.J. Simpson saga. He later surrendered that night and was arrested. But the fact that the networks at that point would have gone whole hog, would have even abandoned an NBA final to cover something like that was just something that would never have happened, just a few years before. And what they did that night, what CNN did in the year that followed, covering the trial full time during the day, ignoring any other news, just to show a celebrity trial. It was a very important transition point. And it really changed what we see on television now, because NBC in particular went whole hog after the story. They would do 2 segments every single day. They'd have a package, they'd have a panel. This is a 22-minute evening newscast. They were dedicating that much to this tabloid story. And it really changed the landscape of the evening news, because NBC, which was sort of an also-ran at that point, ended up becoming the #1 newscast, which it still is today, although it's getting close with ABC, because ABC is now doing what NBC did 20 years ago and getting more tabloid and getting more fluffy and going down that road of not really caring about serious, courageous journalism and doing more of that stuff. And I got to say, in the interest of full disclosure, I was Good Morning America, which was ABC back then. Peter Jennings, refused to do it. He said, we're only going to do the O.J. story when news merits it, when something really happens that's worthwhile. But while NBC was doing the opposite and just going all the way, and that's what created this transition. ABC, which had been #1, ends up losing to NBC because NBC does all this tabloid stuff on O.J. And I spent months in Los Angeles at different times being the O.J. correspondent for Good Morning America, which did do O.J. every single day. So ABC wasn't pure, but it was certainly much purer in the evening and only doing it when it was serious. And so, but now, ABC is challenging NBC because it's doing weather, it's doing more tabloid news, celebrity stuff. David Muir, the new main anchor, as I was talking about at the symposium earlier today, did a story about Viola Davis, who's the star of one of the ABC primetime stories. There was no substance to it at all. It was just, here I am, celebrity anchor with celebrity actress, and there was no news value to the story. at all. Peter Jennings, I'm sure, was turning around in his grave as that happened. But the next event, Peter couldn't stop himself because nobody could. It was sort of the next. He really tried to hold out against tabloid coverage and really push for international news. That's why then his newscast was named World News Tonight. But he couldn't stop the train of tabloid with the next story, and that one broke in January of 1998. And then the world was focused on Cuba because Pope John Paul II was going to Cuba. And it was the first ever papal visit. Hopes were high that the man who had managed to slay the dragon of communism in his native Poland would be able to do it in Cuba, which was one of the last bastions of the Cold War, as I guess it still is today. And media from around the world descended on Havana, which is where I was born and hadn't been back since I was 2. And I was sent to Cuba 10 days before the Pope arrived, and the anticipation was like nothing I'd ever seen. CBS, NBC, ABC, the 3 networks, CNN, and now the new Fox News channel spent millions of dollars sending. There were so many of us down there in Cuba, you have no idea. It was an army of journalists had descended on Havana to cover the Pope's visit. And every single one of the main anchors, Jennings, Rather, Brokaw, Ted Koppel, who did Nightline back then, it was supposed to be a week of shows from Havana. This was, it was this major event. And on January 21st, the networks were trumpeting the Pope's arrival. It was the first night of all the network news anchors there. And it was also the night that the news started breaking in mainstream media about this White House intern. And the next morning I spent with Peter Jennings because he was doing a story about my return to Cuba. And I barely talked to him that morning because he was constantly in touch with New York as the Monica Lewinsky story was breaking, because they were trying to figure out, what do we do? And by that night, the anchors at that point, they were stuck in Havana. They did their shows, but then all the plans, all the millions of dollars were thrown out the window. They got all on their airplanes and they headed back to the United States. So this huge international story had been, sacrificed to this sordid tale of sex at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And again, Cuba remains a Cold War relic to this day. Could television have changed that? I don't know. And I completely understand that a story that threatened the survival of the presidency would take precedence almost over anything else. But, this all-important story just disappeared. And so did, of course, any other news at that point. And, once you spend weeks speculating about sex at the White House, about what may or may not have happened in the Oval Office, about what was on the infamous blue dress and what the meaning of is, nothing is out of bounds. And so that really became, I think, the sort of that final step in the tabloidization of TV news. And a few years later, I gave in 2001, May of 2001, I gave a college commencement speech. And I lamented, that in this era of globalization, how when countries around the world were increasingly interdependent, that television news was increasingly ignoring what was happening around the world, elsewhere on the planet. And I mentioned a couple of examples, including this computer virus that had been started in the Philippines and how it spread around the world, caused billions of dollars in damage. How this little thing in the Philippines created a major worldwide computer mess. And of course, just showing how things on the other side of the earth could affect us here at home. Clearly, my examples were pathetically simplistic, given what happened 4 months later. Do any of you remember Chandra Levy and Gary Condit? Yeah, probably the older ones amongst us. Chandra Levy was another DC intern. Gary Condit was a California congressman. So again, it was another powerful man, another Washington intern, and they had an affair. Levy disappeared, and it was the biggest story of that year. It was everywhere, and it was a big story on September 10th of 2001 because Condit had been. A grand jury decided not to indict him for obstruction of justice. So it was the story that was still leading the newscasts on September 10th. The next morning, I ventured that most Americans knew who Chandra Levy and Gary Condit were, but they had no idea who this Saudi was who was about to be responsible for the worst terrorist attack ever. And back then, the weeks that followed 9/11, everybody talked about how, it would change America, how it would change news, how Americans and their news organizations would pay more attention to what was happening around the world. You know, we did for a while, though I guess we didn't have much choice because we had, you know, wars going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. But, you know, once we beat the Taliban and Osama bin Laden was in hiding and the Iraq war dragged on, interest again waned in what was happening around the world. And now here we are 30 years after the networks lost their independence, and 20 years after OJ, and 16 after Monica Lewinsky, 13 after 9/11. Nobody's arguing whether TV is a business anymore. That's clear. It's become a major profit center. Most news organizations make money. We have more than a dozen cable networks, cable news networks, if you include you know, news, business, and sports. Local stations, some that bring you, you know, there are hundreds of them that bring you news sometimes 24 hours a day. Of course, they're all the online video sources. There's so much news, but quantity certainly does not equal quality. And the broadcast networks have given up all pretense of being true worldwide news organizations. They only have a minimal presence overseas. They've dramatically reduced coverage even inside the United States. You know, on the cable front, we've got, you know, Fox and MSNBC mostly doing opinion. They're kind of enclosed in their echo chambers, engaging in what Jon Stewart called appropriately an ideological arms race. And you know, and even in their newsier shows, the ones that they label news and not opinion, the reality is that most of what they report is slanted. CNN has its moments, but CNN so often gets lost in some big trial or in, you know, a plane that disappears or in, you know, a disease outbreak, and forget, you know, it's like they forget that anything else is going on in the world, and I just think it hurts us so much. It's really, I'm very passionate about this. You know, and CNN is slashing its news staff. They're doing these produced series that they can repeat over and over again, and that takes away more of our real-time news. If you pardon the plug, Al Jazeera America is trying to do unbiased, you know, hard news without injecting opinion from around the country and around the world. But you know, there's very little news that pays attention to the rest of the world right now, in my opinion. And you know, the local news front is a little bit better because they're producing more news. They're hiring people again, but again, it's quantity and not quality, because the bottom line for these local news organizations is, you know, why spend tens of thousands of dollars on those great investigative stories that used to be done, that really kept local governments in check, that brought, you know, important community issues to the fore? You know, it costs a fortune. It takes a reporter and a producer and a crew out of the mix for weeks. So why do that when you can just very cheaply send the reporter to cover the latest house fire or hit and run accident? Or, you know, local news has also abandoned, I think, its mission of doing serious news. In the old days, when I traveled as a correspondent and I'd go to any new city, I'd put on the local news, the late local news, and I knew that I'd find out if something important had happened around the country. I knew if something had happened around the world. Now, everything is as local as possible, looking for higher ratings and, you know, to make more money, and really, in my opinion, just abandoning serious news on a local level. So it's a problem that's really across the television industry, and it's really sad, because it's just the things. I mean, last night, did you guys see this whole thing about Renee Zellweger? I mean, I saw it on two, you know, major discussions about Renee Zellweger's face today on national news. In the 20 minutes I managed to watch national news this morning. You know, we pay so much attention to Miley Cyrus twerking, or that silly fight. Remember the whole Santa is white thing last year? You guys didn't see that one? Santa's white? Yeah. How much time was spent on that? You know, in a non-serious way too, which is, but again, it's aiming at getting that lowest common denominator to try to get them. It's easy to appeal through those kinds of stories to try to get more people to watch, as opposed to, you know, explaining to people why nuclear North Korea is important, or trying to figure out what the differences are between Shia and Sunni. Again, I don't want to sound like some prudish purist up here, but I am very frustrated at what I've seen, because I believe TV news can, you know, it can and include, you know, not just hard news. It can include sports. It can include some weather. It can include features. It can include some entertainment. It can include some opinion, just like newspapers and magazines do. In fact, it really bugs me when TV news, when newspaper critics of TV complain about how TV does this and does that, because the reality is newspapers do it all the time. And I think there's a place for everything in our society on television. But it's that we've gone too far, in my opinion, to go toward those back-of-the-book stories. And I believe in capitalism. I understand that news networks are important divisions of businesses that have responsibility as shareholders. But I really think you can make money appealing to an intelligent, serious audience. That you can make money producing serious, important, relevant, and minimally biased news. And I say minimally biased because I'm biased, you're biased, the person sitting next to you is biased. But I do think that there's a way of trying, and through good reporting and good editing, to do news that, pardon the pun, is fair and balanced. And I think we can reach, many years ago, I read one author talking about enlightened subjectivity. I think that's something that's a goal that's reachable, and we can do that, and I think we can do that in a way that brings people in. The good news is that the latest Pew Research and Gallup polls show that television news is still the main source of current event information for most Americans, except some of you younger ones. Under 29, you go to the internet more. But the immediacy of television, the power of its images, it'll continue to bring the world, if it's allowed, into our newsrooms, as long as the news organizations don't bow to ratings pressure and to these surveys that show that Americans don't care for the serious stuff, especially international news. If we ignore the world, we're doing it at our own peril. Look at what's just happened. Until American healthcare workers contracted Ebola and were brought here to Georgia a couple of months ago, who was paying attention to Ebola? It's shows like mine. Now we can only hope that it's not too late. The general in charge of the U.S. Effort in West Africa has said that the 1,700 beds, the facilities we're putting together, they're going to have 1,700 beds, are going to be done sometime late November, early December. But the World Health Organization is saying that by then we could be seeing 10,000 new cases a week. So the international effort is way too late, and I think part of it is because television news is not bringing its power to bear to call attention to the important things that are happening around the world. And an uncontrolled spread of Ebola in Africa could be a tremendous danger to the American homeland. Until ISIL beheaded the 2 Americans, was anybody really paying attention to these extremists who want to take the world back to a brutal Middle Ages? They had overrun a good chunk of Iraq and Syria, and virtually nobody was paying attention. We have to find a way to engage Americans, and that's going to be a challenge for those of you who decide to be broadcast journalists, to engage Americans in what's happening around the world. We can't wait until a disease gets out of control or Americans get beheaded. At a time of this unprecedented surveillance and persecution of journalists like James Risen of the New York Times, James Rosen of Fox, Glenn Greenwald, whom you honored this year, and Laura Poitras, who helped him out, it's going to require the kind of courage that people like Ivan Watson of CNN showed, going in a helicopter up to Mount Sinjar in Iraq and telling the story of those desperate Yazidis, that CBS's Clarissa Ward demonstrated by going into Syria and interviewing some of these Islamic extremists who could have beheaded her. That many journalists have had going into the Ebola zone. Al Jazeera's Josh Rushing just did incredible reporting going in with the Kurdish Peshmerga into a town in Iraq that they just took over from ISIL. The flags were still flying of ISIL, and there was a sniper firing while he was still reporting. These stories by brave broadcast journalists are really unrivaled, I think, still, and I think in the long term will be, unrivaled in their ability to affect public opinion, to sway elected officials. Would those thousands of Yazidis be alive today if television images hadn't brought their plight and inspired U.S. action? We're seeing what's happening in Kobani in northern Syria. If the television images of those Turkish tanks just sitting there on the border doing nothing, as these people face what the UN is saying is going to be a massacre on the level of Srebrenica in the old Yugoslavia, where thousands of people were massacred. If TV news hadn't kept paying attention to that story, do you think the coalition would have intensified its bombing and now maybe have saved these guys? Personally, I don't think so. I think television and bringing these stories to life can have tremendous power and can save lives. This is just and again, would West Africans have much hope of surviving Ebola under these circumstances if finally some brave journalists had not gone in and brought that story to life? and I just mentioned a few of the courageous journalists who've proven they are willing to risk their lives to tell stories that must be told. I have friends who have died. I have friends who have suffered critical injuries. I have friends who have been kidnapped. I've got 3 Al Jazeera colleagues who have been in jail, have been in prison in Egypt now for 10 months. From Afghanistan to Syria to Liberia, American broadcast journalists are facing terrible dangers every day, and I really hope that television executives have the courage to support them, to let them tell their stories, because it really is not hyperbole to say that millions of lives could depend on their efforts. I really thank you for listening. I hope I brought something here that's not too depressing to the table, because I do have great faith in what television news can do. And I think it's a great career still, and I wish you all the best, and I really thank you for listening, and I'm very honored to have been here, and thank you very much.